I'm going to describe to you how I went from blindness to sight, or if you will, how I got rescued out of the box. And I'll do this as quickly and as in a summary fashion as I can. I remember when I was 8 years old making a conscious decision to embrace my parents' faith by consciously walking an aisle down to the front of the church and saying, I believe, and asking to be baptized, which I then received baptism. However, when I was 13 years old, or maybe 14, I got angry at God. We had merged two junior highs in town, and my junior high came from the wrong side of town, and we were the odd kids out, but one of the popular girls from the right side of town had asked me to go to a church event at her church. And I desperately wanted to go, but I had come down with a summer cold of some sort and was sick as a dog. And I needed to get well in 3 days, and so I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed. And I didn't get healed. Well, I showed my parents and God anyway. I went sick. Had the worst time of my life. Of course, she never talked to me again, and I never talked to her. Never had a date again or anything like that. But I guess I made a vow, unknown to myself, I just won't believe in you anymore. I don't consciously remember thinking that, but subconsciously, well, I'll show you, I just won't believe in you anymore. And so from that moment on, if someone asked me what I was, I would have said, oh, I'm probably a good atheist. I just don't believe anymore. And for about 5 years, I went to church every Sunday with my parents, was elected president of the youth group, and didn't believe in God anymore. 5 years after that, when I was 18 years old, an event happened where a buddy of mine was speaking at the Baptist church, and I was touched by what he had to say. And I remember that Sunday night going home a little bit troubled because he had been a strong believer. And I actually knelt by my bed that night before going to sleep. And I said something like probably, God, if you're real, save me. In those days, of course, I meant from a Calvinistic hellfire and damnation, this angry God who was out to kill me. But now I know I was saying, I've gotten myself entangled in unbelief and I can't get out. Save me from my unbelief. Regardless of whatever words I used, before I could put the period on the sentence, something happened on the inside of me, and I knew that I had been rescued out of the field of unbelief that I had stumbled into. I remembered having the worst night of sleep I've ever had in my life, tossing and turning, probably talking in my sleep. And the first conscious thought I had the next morning when I woke up is, I have been called to preach. In a Baptist world, that's the only thing you can be called to do. I had been called to serve God or to follow God in some sort of service. That's what I was saying. So I graduated from high school and I went off as a preacher boy to a religious college. And I touched on that last week with you, that in my required Old Testament class and New Testament class, decided there was nothing to believe in, so I just put my Bible on the shelf and instead of majoring in religion, started majoring in philosophy, which I did. But I couldn't shake that one single event when I had knelt by my bed. And so I still signed up for seminary. And why are you going to seminary? I'm going to see if there's anything left to believe in. And again, I touched on this last week, so I won't dwell here. But if I thought there was nothing to believe in after college, I was totally convinced of that after seminary, after we destroyed the Old Testament, the New Testament, and everything else that might be around. So I remember being about 25 years old in the seminary bookstore, maybe my senior year, browsing for what good book I could get, and anytime I got a gift of some money, I'd go buy a book. And so I'm browsing, and I came across a book there. There was a rack, an InterVarsity Press rack, which, in the arrogance of my academic education, I knew to really not be worth my time, since it was conservative, trite stuff. But I looked anyway, and I picked up a book by a man by the name of Francis Schaeffer. And I judged his book by what he had to say about Rudolf Bultmann, the great German liberal theologian. So I flipped to the back, and sure enough, he's listed. And I flipped to the page where his name was, and he essentially said Bultmann was wrong. I went, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Shut his book, put it back. I did not know it, but my phone was ringing. I just didn't hear it that day in that bookstore. A year later, I'm on my way making a journey that took me via Nuremberg, Germany, before going to graduate school in Switzerland. And some people in the States said, oh, you're headed to Switzerland. Are you going to go to L'Abri when you're there? L'Abri being the place that Francis and Edith Schaeffer did their theological, philosophical work from in Switzerland. And I said, no, they have nothing to offer me. This time the phone might have been ringing and I heard it, but I decided I wasn't going to answer it. So I go off overseas, and I'm going to fast forward on the top of page 37 to January 1980. I now find myself without a job, almost out of money. I had enough money to last through January. And the only thing I had left to believe in January of 1980 was that when I was 18 years old, I had knelt beside my bed and an event happened inside of me that I could not doubt had happened. And I'd been out hustling for jobs, nothing would come along. And in my despair, I had gone to all the places. We didn't have bishops, so you went to a Baptist association group. The guy looked at me, pulled out a drawer. It had 250 resumes in it. He tossed mine in there and says, you haven't got a chance. So in that total despair, I remember praying this outlandish prayer. God, you called me to preach. I did not call me to preach. It's up to you to find me a place to serve you. It's not up to me to go find a place to serve you. So I'm going to quit trying. I have enough money to make it till the end of the month. And if you haven't come through by then, I quit being a preacher. And I will maybe still believe in you, but I will not work for you anymore. It wasn't a threat, it was just despair. The next afternoon, my phone rang. I was sitting out on my front porch quiddling on a 2x4. That's what I did. That's what I was going to do for the rest of January. The phone rang, and the man who had told me he had 250 names on file and I didn't have a chance was calling saying he had just had a church call him and he thought I was their man, and would I go on a Sunday night to a neutral site and give a sermon. They would be planted in the audience, and then they would chat with me later if they thought it was worth chatting with me about. So I did that. They asked to speak with me afterwards. We chatted, and then they invited me to come to their church the following week, what was called in those circles to preach in view of a call. And so I was to go speak on Sunday morning and Sunday night. So on that Sunday morning, I took my last $10 and put gasoline in my car to drive the 20 miles to that church. And I spoke, and then spoke again that night. They asked me to stay while they took their vote among the congregation of whether they wanted me to be their pastor or not. And they voted that they would ask me to do the job. And so I was grateful to now have a job. And then the church secretary came up to me and handed me a check. And I said, "What's this?" And she said, "It's your first week's salary. We pay in advance." I had spent my last $10 that morning and had prayed to God that if I didn't have a job by the time I was out of money, I wouldn't serve him officially again. The phone was ringing. 3 hours later, I received a phone call from the ICU ward of a hospital saying that a member of this church that I was now the pastor of was dying, and I went to the hospital. They had amputated the man's leg. The family was there. I looked into his face. I looked into the wife's face, the son and daughter's face. And they needed answers I did not possess. And I remember when I left the hospital saying, I will not be a hypocrite to these people. And out of my selfishness, I said, God, would you please let this man live long enough for me to see if I can find answers for people facing death. My nice liberal theology that counted by 10s or 12s or 20s, somehow death wasn't in the picture in that theology. Please let this man live so I can find something for him and us to believe in. He lived 5 months, died just after July the 4th. 1 week later, his 7-year-old niece died. I was in the hospital room when she died. First time I'd ever witnessed a person dying. And on that day, my 9-dot man-made theology died with her. I gave up all efforts of trying to figure out a way to make sense inside the box. And in the 1st of August, after the funerals were over, I went into a Christian bookstore. And I remember standing outside the door saying, I need help. And if there is a book in this bookstore that will help me begin to make sense and find you, direct me to it. It was a huge bookstore, not a tiny one. Somehow I walked in and almost directly went over and picked up this book by Francis Schaeffer, The God Who Is There. The same book I had picked up in the seminary bookstore those earlier years. This time when the phone rang, I bought the book. Read the book, read the next one that came with it, Escape from Reason. And then I read the one that probably put the nail in the coffin for me. He is there, and he is not silent. That's the two dots outside of the box. He is there, and he is not silent. I ended up reading every book, bought every book that Francis Schaeffer wrote. Little by little, crawled out of philosophy. Read every book that his wife wrote. My wife eventually gave me the complete collected works of the whole deal in a nice bound set. And so there was this total reversal of this sequence of what comes after 12. It was like a slow climb through the years, making my way upward to getting back to seeing that we count by 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, Francis Schaeffer didn't get out of the box. He got close. I didn't get out of the box because of Francis Schaeffer, but I got close. And I was the book Labrie. I brought this from our kitchen. It's still in our kitchen. It's got the recipe for a chocolate sauce we've used with all of our children in it. It became a cookbook for us because it had Edith's recipes in it she used in Switzerland. God is so good. Slaps me with my ear against every day. You know, nah, I don't need that. Oh, yes, you do. The phone is ringing. Over and over and over, the phone was ringing, and I didn't know how to answer it.